I know I'm gonna be butting my head against a brick wall with this one because there's a reason they say you can't fix stupid, but I can prove that we can laugh at him the entire time. Last weekend was Valentine's Day, better known as what would have been the 87th birthday of the ocean's second largest paperweight. And so today we're gonna make it her second death day and put her in the ground because the ocean floor wasn't far enough down. Yep, today we're gonna re-sink the supposed pride of the Kriegsmarine, the battleship Bismarck. This is the German version of the Titanic. I know that's insulting to the Titanic, but it makes a lot of sense when you look at the order of operations. She was built to be the biggest, hyped up a ton, then sailed one mission and died, except one died to a single icy rock, while the other died to a metric ton of spicy rocks. And both wrecks were discovered by the same scientists, so it actually lines up pretty well. Stop calling it she. The officers referred to the ship with masculine terms. Okay, first of all, history is written by the victors, shoulda won.
Still lose the war though.
Second, I'll call her whatever I want because I'm having a hard time hearing your moaning and groaning over the sound of Daddy Rodney's 16-inch guns bending her bridge over the table.
Which set of prints were yours in the sand? The hand prints, the knee prints, or the footprints behind those?
And third, it's real funny how you'll back up the commanding officer over the ship's preferred pronouns, but take exception to his scraping the symbol of stupid off the deck when he was at sea because he hated the Nazis. Also, the only reason the officers did that was because, in the words of the ship's captain, the Bismarck was, quote, far too large and powerful to be female, and there were ladies back then who could have run him for that, let alone today. And just because you tried to start a fight over that, I'm gonna go ahead and give Bismarck a feminine nickname. I'm gonna call her Busy. Nice and short, and I'm kinda surprised no one did that sooner. But as every sane individual watching this video can tell, this battleship has received a lot of support over the years, resulting in a frequent place of fame that is very overhyped and highly ignorant of technicalities. So I wanted to find out what it did wrong, what it did right, and if it really deserves any place in the rankings of historical hype, and I took it from the top. Because when Germany built the Bismarck, they actually looked like they were going to follow the rules. Originally, and not the original set of rules. Step back to 1919. The Treaty of Versailles has just been signed, World War I is over, and because they lost, Germany's military gets a new level cap, which hits their navy particularly hard. Article 181 of the Treaty of Versailles restricted the total number of active commissioned warships in the German Navy, or Reichsmarine, in both class and number. At most, they were allowed to have 6 battleships of the borderline ancient 13 to 14,000 ton Deutschland or Lotharingen pre-dreadnought classes, 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 12 patrol craft or torpedo boats, which is basically nothing. It's like enough for coastal patrol and maybe 2 battle groups that are way out of date.
This is not an army.
And to make the German Navy even more of a non-factor, they also had to scrap any new warships being built. And Article 190 prevented those existing ships from being replaced within 20 years of the day they were launched. Any replacement battleships would also have to be lighter than the ones they were replacing, with a hard cap of 10,000 tons in weight, which I have a hard time calling a battleship when you stand it next to the American 35,000 ton South Dakota class and 43,000 ton Iowa class. That's more like a light or maybe a heavy cruiser. But Germany lost the war, and so that's the best they're allowed. Fast forward to 1927, the old Deutschland class of battleships is now a few years past their 20th birthday, so in concert with the Versailles limitations, the Reichsmarine began discussing what they were going to replace them with. They would eventually choose to go with a heavy cruiser type design instead of a slow, heavy monitor type, which they referred to as the Panzerschiffe, or tank ships, which would eventually become the Deutschland-class heavy cruisers. The first of these began construction in February 1929 as Panzerschiff A, with the other 2 Panzerschiffe B and C following over the next few years. Then January 30th, 1933 rolls around and Adolf the Shitter is appointed Chancellor of Germany.
God damn it.
With the Crooked Cross Party in charge, the new Chancellor then turns to the Commander-in-Chief of the Reichsmarine as of 1928, now Admiral Erich Raeder. Adolf tells Raeder that he wants to focus on a broader German goal of taking control of Europe, meaning that Raeder's new job is to rebuild the Navy to take out enemy navies they expected to fight, and by navies, I mean Navy singular, and by that, I mean the French. For whatever reason, they just weren't planning on fighting anyone else. Japan was too far away, Italy he liked, dictatorial royal birds of a feather and all. England would beat the brat right off of their worst, America wasn't interested in fighting another war, and the Soviet Navy had recently begun their long-standing tradition of being a joke courtesy of the Japanese. So that just left the French, who had responded to the Deutschland-class Panzerschiffe in 1932 by announcing the construction of two 26,500-ton battlecruisers. These were soon to be named the Dunkirk and the Strasbourg, which would outmuscle, outweigh, and outrun Germany's first few Panzerschiffe. Because unlike the Germans, the French, along with multiple other nations, were held to weight restrictions established by a separate treaty, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, along with various amendments resulting from the following London Naval Conference in 1930. Moron Mustachio responded by authorizing two more ships as Panzerschiffe D and E in December 1933, which began construction in 1934 and eventually became the Scharnhorst class. Now, both the Deutschland class and the Scharnhorst class Panzerschiffe were going to quietly end at least several thousand tons over the Versailles Treaty limits. But the same year that Panzerschiffe D was laid down, the Reichsmarine, for whatever reason, was already considering the construction of a 35,000-ton ship called Panzerschiff F to contest the French with. And since this was in blatant violation of the Versailles Treaty, the project was originally nicknamed the Ersatz Hanover, implying that it was a replacement ship for the SMS Hanover pre-dreadnought still in service. While I have no idea what possessed the Germans to overstep the rules that far, the most likely factor is Mustache Face himself, not only because he liked his propaganda symbols, but because the year he'd been appointed, he had already started planning a way to negotiate with England to try and lessen the Versailles restrictions and expand the Reichsmarine even further. He also seemed to think he could become friends with England. Why he thought that was going to work out, I have no idea. My best reasonable guess is that he probably thought that with World War I over, the British and French would go back to biting at each other's throats and it would be easy to drive a wedge between them, possibly even allowing Germany and Britain to team up in the same way the Black Brunswickers did during the Napoleonic Wars. But like I said, that is a guess, and it's just as likely that Mustache Man simply wasn't thinking very hard. But nevertheless, he kickstarted the process, probably under the assumption that his negotiation plan would work. And on March 16, 1935, he would reveal step 1 by announcing a massive buildup of the German armed forces and rejecting the limits imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Because it turns out Angry Painter Man's method of negotiating was to just flip the entire table like an angry stepdad and use the Brits' desires to both maintain naval supremacy and prevent another world war against them to negotiate an increase through their appeasement. And while it sounds really annoying, Adolf's negotiation tactic wasn't new. This time-old play was something that America's president today would refer to as the big ask, where you go way overboard on your initial demands and then scale back to what you actually want. Although in the German case, it wasn't scaling back so much as it was demanding that the British give them what they wanted, take it or leave it. Over the next few months, the British would invite the Germans to the negotiating table to try and prevent another runaway naval buildup like before World War I. However, as would sound par for the course now, the German delegation led by Joachim von Ribbentrop, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Agency Genstel Ribbentrop, basically walked in, rejected all British terms, and demanded that they be allowed to build warships equal to 35% of the total tonnage that the British Commonwealth had been allowed to build in the Washington Naval Treaty, before they would even begin negotiating anything else. This number had apparently been chosen by the Mustache Man himself, because he thought that was the tonnage ratio that France had been given in the Washington Treaty, putting him on par to take them out. He was wrong, he went to art school, not mat school, and he wasn't even very good at that, and so while the French actually had a 50% share, he ended up stuck at 35, probably to avoid giving away his attacking intentions.
I see. Okay.
By June 18, 1935, the German delegation had effectively intimidated the British into getting their 35%, along with a 45% ratio for submarines, in a new treaty, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. And interestingly enough, while it is commonly accepted that this agreement also held them to the standards of the Washington Naval Treaty, I was never able to find any explicit statement that the now Kriegsmarine was bound to the armament and weight limitations on individual ships from the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the following treaties, only that the Germans negotiated for 35% the tonnage of the British Navy. However, since the British Navy's strength was determined by the Washington Naval Treaty and its subsequent adjustments, and all the agreement says is that the weight limits were as defined by treaty, I think it was just generally implied and accepted that the same armament and weight standards would apply to Germany as everyone else, despite never being outright written down. Oh no. Despite this seeming loophole, however, Adolphus Damascus would act highly compliant with all treaty limitations after this point, at least for a while. And if I had to guess why, it would, once again, be because the Brits had a navy level cap 3 times theirs, and Germany was still building up the ships they needed to break the rules. Even if they had funded and built ships non-stop, Raeder and the Kriegsmarine Command estimated they wouldn't be able to fight the British Navy head-on 1-for-1 until 1945. So if the Germans jumped the gun on the treaty limits in any way, the Royal Navy probably would have turned around and made the Germans go fucking extinct.
I will personally introduce you to the ground.
He probably never intended to stick to the limits forever, though, or at all in this case, because hell, he'd at least been theoretically planning a war against Britain as early as 1933. But since the Royal Navy would make the Kriegsmarine look like a Lego set for almost 15 years, going head-to-head wasn't going to be an option unless he could negotiate for time, hence the pursuit of a treaty. Turns out backstabbing his own treaties was kind of his plan for everyone, not just the Soviets. But at the very least, appearing to comply would buy him a window of time to where he could build up the Kriegsmarine without having any plans shot out from under his ass ahead of schedule. And with the denunciation negotiation out of the way and their violations of the Treaty of Versailles now effectively and officially approved by the British, Germany could also begin building bigger ships without concern, although that wouldn't stop them from breaking the rules anyways and not telling anyone, because it's only a crime if you get caught. And they felt they had a good reason to build a new one, because in response to the Scharnhorst-class battleships and 2 35,000-ton Italian Littorio-class battleships, the French had gone and ordered 2 35,000-ton Richelieu-class battleships of their own with 15-inch guns that same year. So Germany, now seemingly bound to the treaty limitations, would officially give the go-ahead for building a 35,000-ton warship of their own.
Send it.
They had originally planned on using a 35cm or 14-inch armor belt and a 10cm or 4-inch thick deck, but they realized that due to the weight restrictions, the armor belt would put them way overweight, so they slimmed the belt down to 32cm or 12.6 inches thick. They had also originally planned on 13-inch or 33cm guns, but these were quickly being outpaced by their peers, and so Admiral Raeder and the Kriegsmarine decided to kick the firepower up a notch to 14-inch or 35cm guns, the limit allowed by the London Naval Conference in 1930. However, he would quickly find himself overruled by Stupid Mustache Face, probably in his personal need for massive propaganda symbols. Moron Mustachio would look at the treaty-compliant Panzerschiff F design and respond with the phrase, "Ich will ein Schlachtschiff," or "I want a battleship." And so what was probably supposed to be a battle cruiser was reworked into the Schlachtschiff or Battleship project, with newer 15-inch or 38cm guns, which also put the ship over the treaty weight limit, which meant the battleship's true weight now had to become a military secret.
Be very, very quiet.
But that wasn't the only secret, since the guns would also go over the treaty limits of 14 inches and possibly give away her new 39,000-ton displacement. That had to be kept quiet as well, and so the ship was only announced as having a displacement of 35,000 tons and 14-inch guns. By November 16th that year, the ship was officially ordered from the Blom & Voss shipbuilding firm, who also had to keep their stats close to the chest even after the Second London Naval Treaty was signed on March 25th, 1936. During that conference, the Japanese and the Italians didn't like the portions of the naval pie they were being given and walked out, which triggered an escalator clause that increased the maximum gun caliber on capital ships to 16 inches. This technically made the Bismarck's guns fully legal, but they never said anything because that would basically scream to the entire planet,
rules were meant to be broken.
However, unlike what some people seem to believe, that escalator clause held no provision for an increase in maximum weight. That would show up separately in 1938, about 2 years after Bismarck's keel was laid down on July 1st, 1936. That year, the United States, France, and Britain, concerned about Japan now implying they were building 40,000-plus-ton battleships, would agree to amend the escalator clause in the Second London Naval Treaty to also allow a max displacement of 45,000 tons. So now the Bismarck's full weight, totaling 41,700 tons, was also legal. But again, they didn't say anything because they didn't want to convince the Brits to put down their tea and come over there. The secretly overweight ship's hull would be launched on Valentine's Day 1939 from its dry dock in Hamburg, Germany. It would receive the name Bismarck after the first German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and by launch time it had cost the nation of Germany 197 million Reichsmarks, aka $79 million in 1939 money or $1.8 billion today. The ship was fully assembled over the following months and commissioned on August 29, 1940, spending the next several months undergoing sea trials and training to get fully ready for action. And while this battleship was nowhere near the kind of be-all, end-all Wunderwaffe that all the fanboys make it out to be, for all the smack talk I am about to induce, Busy was very much still a battleship, and a powerful one at that. She was also one of the largest, showing up with a max displacement of 41,700 tons while being 820 feet or a quarter kilometer long and 118 feet or 36 meters wide. She also sat deeper in the water than all but two other ship classes of the war, the Yamato and Iowa classes, by having a draft, or distance below the water, of 34.5 feet or 10.5 meters. That deep draft was primarily due to her thick armor, which never changed despite her increase in gun caliber. Altogether, roughly 19,000 tons or 40% of Bismarck's weight was just armor plating, and it could have been a lot heavier had they not made the Bismarck one of the first ships in German history to use a mostly welded hull construction. Previously, ships had used riveted hulls, which required rivets and longer overlapping metal plates that could add more than 15,000 tons to a ship's weight by itself, while also creating distinct structural weak points at the riveted joints. By swapping to welding for 90% of the hull, it better solidified Busy's construction and made her just as modern a warship as the others of her time, which for all her faults was pretty good for a nation that hadn't made battleships in about 20 years.
Impressive. Very nice.
Just as impressive was the material the armor was made from. The Bismarck was protected with face-hardened Krupp cemented steel, which was harder at the outer face and softer towards the rear. This meant the front would stop the impact of a shell and the rear would absorb any penetration and smoothly deform in the event of penetration to reduce the amount of shrapnel thrown into the interior, known as spalling. Krupp steel also possessed one of the highest metallurgical purities of any armor material of the war, clocking it at between 90% and even 100% pure steel. There was also a 50mm or 2-inch layer of teak wood behind the main belt to stop the armor plates from cracking under an impact, which themselves were already 320mm or 12.5 inches thick. However, that belt armor hides a hotly debated feature that is nowhere near as invincible as the fanboys claim: the turtleback. The turtleback was a 120mm or 4 3/4 inch steel plate angled at 22 degrees, which connected the base of the armor belt to the same thickness roof of the citadel, or the armored core of the ship. It was a World War I era innovation, and its purpose was to deflect any shell penetrating the main belt upwards and away from the citadel. Striking flat on, the slope of these plates increases their effective thickness to as high as 320mm, making the total theoretical effective armor thickness from a direct 90-degree head-on shot to be 640mm or just over 2 feet of steel. So the Bismarck has the best armor of any battleship. Not even close, because there's a reason I kept specifying theoretical and direct 90-degree shot. If naval gunfire were to come in from so high that it skips the armor plate entirely and goes straight through the deck, now the only thing it's doing is helping to prime the shell's fuses to go off where they're supposed to, in your stomach. It's like a kick-me sign for your internal organs or foreplay for getting shot.
Really rearranged his guts with that one.
And since what's known as the angle of fall, aka the angle the shell hits you at, gets steeper the farther away you're shot from, the farther away you get, the more visible that kick-me sign gets. The only reason the Bismarck still had a turtleback is because nobody was willing to sacrifice any of their ships to do more armor testing for the best possible design. On top of that, they expected most of the fighting to happen around the Baltic and North Seas in future naval conflicts, where ships would be forced to fight in close. That was also why Bismarck had such a deep draft for her time, and why she was given the Atlantic bow. If you're not catching my drift here, World War I trench raids gave the Germans so much PTSD they decided to make their battleships into giant floating shotguns. So Germany pretty much just said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and just rehashed the turtleback scheme from World War I, which had been designed for ranges below roughly 13 to 14,000 yards. You know, completely ignoring both any possible advances in guns you should reasonably expect an enemy to make, on top of the Battle of Jutland, where Warspite and the rest of the Royal Navy were accurately bitch-slapping the Reichsmarine at roughly 20,000 yards. The Battle of Jutland only proves the turtleback worked because the Germans didn't lose any capital ships, blah. Again, no, the Brits only lost capital ships because their commanding officer thought it would be a brilliant friggin' idea to leave the blast doors open to the turrets to decrease the reload time. Guess what happened when the Germans shot the turrets? So the Brits losing bigger ships at Jutland had nothing to do with the turtleback, and on top of that, everybody who didn't have to pretend to be a defense budget hunchback had already tested the concept, and they proved it didn't work at range nearly as well as the now more common alternative. This alternative armor layout was what America had done from the Battleship get-go, and what the British and Japanese caught on to later, the all-or-nothing concept. All-or-nothing is basically building your ship like it's a main battle tank. Put your armor where you think you'll need it most, and leave the rest light for speed. The Brits figured out the weaknesses of the turtleback scheme through their 1921 Baden trials, where they used the German battleship SMS Baden for target practice to learn German armor weaknesses after the war, and the turtleback design failed completely by the time the shots got out to 15,000 yards. The Japanese tested it out on the Tosa with the same results, and America just never played that card in the first place.
Following's not really my style.
And at the long ranges of naval combat in World War II, what with both Warspite and Scharnhorst scoring 26,000 yard plus shots, almost double the max design range of the turtleback, it was more than outdated by that point, and far too heavy to justify any major advantage over the all-or-nothing layout anywhere other than point-blank range. And if you've got something capable of shooting through a battleship's armor sneaking up on you to within point-blank range, then frankly you have a different problem. Just ask Warspite. Then there's the fact that the ship could, at least in theory, sink while still being fully operable. Because of the ship's deep draft, and because the ship's guns were carrying the weight of a dictator's ego, the Citadel roof was just barely above the waterline with a standard load, which also means that the bottom of the turtleback was below the waterline. That meant that if the belt was penetrated right around the waterline, water could flood in and pull in the gap just on the turtleback slope behind the armor belt. And if it wasn't handled quickly and effectively, it could eventually list until the deck became submerged, which would speed that flooding up until the ship capsized and sank without ever taking critical damage. The Citadel could have been completely watertight and sealed off, and it still would have self-converted to a submarine because the floodable space in the Bismarck basically formed a giant armored bucket for all the water coming in over your head. Granted, that event was highly unlikely, but the fact that it's even theoretically possible raises a few question marks about what the hell was being smoked at the design board. Meanwhile, it was way more likely that a 500 or 1,000 pound miniature sun would be spawned on your deck courtesy of your local aircraft carrier. Most battleships of Busy's time would have an armored deck between the top deck and the Citadel to eat any armor-piercing bombs that punch through the top deck, which is also called the bomb deck. And I say most because Busy doesn't have one. All she's got is the 3-inch or 80mm steel deck over the magazines before any bomb flying through the front door plows straight into the bunker roof, which is real helpful when your magazines are placed right up against that roof. She probably could have had one if they hadn't spent all that weight on the turtleback, but again, they decided to go for the outdated scheme, completely forgetting that planes were a thing now. And speaking of planes, it's probably helpful to mention something about torpedoes. Busy came with a 1 3/4-inch or 4.5cm torpedo bulkhead behind 18 feet or 5.5 meters of empty air and fuel, which acted as spaced armor. It was okay, it worked. It was just that most torpedoes of the time outclassed the protection it offered. Except the British ones, I guess.
Interrupt me whilst I sip my tea.
At least the protection elsewhere was better. Kind of. The conning tower, where all the command work got done, was armored even more heavily than the belt itself, with 350mm or almost 1 foot 2 inches of armor. However, the armored conning tower practice was eventually abandoned by everyone else because, well, sticking that much weight up high causes problems, and there's not much you can do to stop a shell from going through there anyways, as Busy would soon learn. But that still wasn't her thickest armor. Much like a lot of ships, that armor could be found on the turrets, with 14 inches or 360mm on the face. But even that was still far from peak protection, because America had been using 18 inches, a whole freedom foot and a half of Uncle Sam's steel on her turrets since the 1910s, and other nations had followed suit to some degree or another. Other nations also didn't equip their turrets with an angled plate on the front of the roof, which, much like the turtleback plates, would bounce shells at close range and provide a perfect kick-me sign at medium to long ranges. Let's just say the Royal Navy took note.
Goodbye, everyone. Oh, Jesus!
Not all that great of an idea when you decide to put a ready rack for ammunition in the turret. I swear the German engineers wanted this thing to violently detonate. And speaking of explosions, it's time to talk guns. Busy's biggest weapons were her 8 15-inch or 38cm 52 caliber SKC-34 cannons and 4 twin turrets. And fun fact about these turrets, instead of giving them numbers, the Germans gave them letters by way of their own phonetic alphabet from front to back. As a result, turret 1 was turret Anton, 2 was Bruno, 3 was Caesar, and 4 was Dora, like the Explorer. Except the only thing the Germans were planning on exploring afterwards was a shipwreck. Gonna have to put on that Scooby-Dooba gear and split up to look for clues, except the only thing they're gonna find is a giant hole.
Might have gotten away with it, too.
These 15-inch guns would come with just over 1,000 rounds of a couple different can-opening options. These included armor-piercing, high-explosive, or semi-armor-piercing high-explosive types, all of which were roughly 800 kilos or 1,760 pounds. And the C-34s could fling them up to a maximum of 35.5 kilometers or just shy of 39,000 yards. With a fairly high degree of accuracy, I might add, both because of their aiming devices and because the spacing between the barrels also cut down on accuracy losses from the overlapping muzzle flashes you get when you shoot both barrels at once. Although it should be noted, this accuracy was greatly improved in calm seas, and in practice, Bismarck never hit anything outside of 17,000 yards. Additionally, the shells, which were on the lighter side, had a pretty high muzzle velocity and could fly about 8% faster than those of the British. Although in practice, this meant they would more often fire at a flatter trajectory that was more likely to throw the shells into an enemy's belt armor. They were the most powerful guns ever fitted to a battleship. They could even take down the American Iowas. Bull-shiza. And because you've decided to go and be stupid about it, now I have to continue the trend from the last ship video and break out the math again. I even made a graph. Sit down and shut up because school is in session and I'm about to learn you a thing. I mentioned before that the shells were a little lighter than some of their counterparts, and lower shell weight meant less armor penetration. Within close range, what the ship was designed for, the guns were absolutely lethal, punching through 616mm or 24.26 inches of steel at 4.5 kilometers or 5,000 yards, or up to 742mm or 29.23 inches if you were literally putting your barrel against their ship. However, at range, that starts to drop off hard. By 19,700 yards or 18 kilometers, that penetration had dropped to 16.5 inches or 419 millimeters. By 20 kilometers, you were down to 14.3 inches or 364 millimeters, and by the time you got out to 30 kilometers, it was less than 300 millimeters. And Iowa's main armor plate may look like it's only 307 millimeters or just over a foot thick on paper, but that's because the Iowas didn't rely on armor alone. There was a 1.5 inch or 38 millimeter spaced armor plate above the waterline, a fuel cell under the hull's surface, and only after you got through either both of those or the water and the fuel cell would you hit the 307mm plate underneath, which was also sloped at 19 degrees. The slope alone pushed the thickness up to 13.5 inches or 342mm of armor equivalent from direct side on, and the fuel cell would slow the shell down to make it even less effective, so if you're more than 22 kilometers away from an Iowa, it's gonna feel less like the Bismarck versus the Iowa and more like the Guerriere versus the Constitution, aka your rounds are gonna be bouncing harder than a stripper before rent day.
Kinky.
Which, to be fair, is a pretty far distance. However, keep in mind that the Iowa could begin penetrating the Bismarck's 320mm belt armor at 32 kilometers. And by the time it got to 22 kilometers, the Iowa would be outclassing the Bismarck's penetration by more than 2 inches. Because 2 inches does in fact matter if you know how to use it. Although at that distance, it would be landing plunging fire instead, and considering the general lack of deck protection, it would shatter the Bismarck like glass anyways. And yes, I know I was using meters for most of that instead of yards, but don't worry, it's only so the Bismarck's fans can get the picture. A yardstick would only hurt their brains more. And if you understand nothing from all that math and numbers, don't worry, because here's what I'm trying to tell you. The Bismarck is a 9mm and the Iowa is a 45, and by the time the Bismarck got close enough to even penetrate an Iowa, the Iowa would already be dropping an entire LA traffic jam worth of spicy cars through its soul. The beatings will continue until morale improves, or at the very least until your waterline does. And if an Iowa lets once you get that close in the first place, either somebody screwed up or you've been baited in harder than anyone else on the planet.
It's a trap!
There, you just admitted the Bismarck beats the Iowa class at close range. No shit, Stack, that's not what I said. What part of it's a trap did you just fail to reconcile? I said it could penetrate the Iowa at close range, but the Bismarck's guns aren't the only ones who get stronger the closer you get. The minute you get to within 10 to 11,000 yards, right where the turtleback is supposed to be approaching its strongest, the Iowa takes the math textbook and throws it overboard because she can just load full powder and punch through all 640 of the millimeters your stupid-ass turtleback gives you.
Now witness the firepower of this fully armed and operational battle station.
And we're just talking about penetration. We haven't even gotten to the means of delivery. Each of those main guns had the longest recoil stroke of their size class, and the loading mechanism made it artificially longer. That may have been in part because Germany loaded part of each shell's powder charge in a metal casing, which would then need to be ejected, but it was also just stupidly inefficient. That decreased the fire rate. Then the turrets were limited to 2 guns each as well, which I've seen quoted as due to redundancy, weight balance, and other reasons. But in the book Naval Weapons of World War II by John Campbell, another reason is presented, which, given the other issues with the system, seems at the very least highly likely. That being because they hadn't figured out how to German engineer a smaller loading system, forcing the turrets to be ridiculously oversized, and why there were only 2 guns per turret placed so far apart. The loaders also had to reset the gun's elevation between each shot, and if the gun crews pushed for higher fire rates, the ammo hoists and the loading mechanisms would jam, break down, or crumple entirely way more often than they were supposed to. And apparently the rate they were supposed to was not 0. As a result, while the theoretical fire rate was 3 rounds per minute, she only achieved that once in testing, and in reality she maxed out at around 2.4 rounds a minute if you weren't trying to shoot at the horizon. Typically, Busy could keep up a 1.8 round a minute fire rate, almost half her theoretical max. And during her only instance of prolonged combat at 100% health in the Battle of the Denmark Strait, that fire rate averaged about 0.8 to 0.9, less than 1 round fired every minute. And that long list of problems only belonged to the main guns. There were more. Bismarck's combat kit would also come with secondary batteries, those being 6 double-barreled 6-inch or 15-centimeter 55 caliber SKC-28 turrets, which most likely had a total magazine capacity of roughly 2,000 rounds and a max range of 23 kilometers or just over 25,000 yards. They were also the only guns on the Bismarck that didn't have any major outstanding issues. You know, besides putting the ammo rooms right next to the engines. These secondaries were then further complemented by her AA batteries, which, well, they were there.
Oh, that didn't sound good.
Busy had 3 classes of AA guns, heavy, medium, and light, and the heavies were 8 double-barreled 105mm SKC-33 dual-purpose guns with about 7,000 rounds in storage. Although calling them dual-purpose is a bit of a stretch. The 105's shells didn't hit very hard, and the Germans believed that it would take more than a single shot to decently hurt a destroyer-sized ship. And for some reason, Germany decided that a battleship should be able to take on any smaller ship without using its main guns. Like, you have the big guns that could absolutely crumple them, and a bigger bullet means less bad guy, which means less bullets coming back at you. It's just science. Why not use the bigger bullets? But this is World War II Germany we're talking about, so I'm guessing not overthinking just wasn't on the menu for the day. So instead of taking the accuracy by volume approach and just using more 105s, which would simplify logistics and give her the naval broadside version of a 12-gauge, German designers picked a hybrid battery of those 105s and 6-inchers, compromising Busy's effective total fire against air and surface targets at the same time. And some bumbling moron also apparently mounted 2 different kinds of 105s onto the Bismarck's gun mounts because apparently the shipbuilding bureaucracy was corrupt enough to make the Soviet Union blush.
Thank you, sir. Wasn't a compliment.
But the most embarrassing weapon on the Bismarck was without a doubt her medium caliber AA guns. These were 16 37mm SK-C-30 autocannons in 8 twin mounts with 31,100 rounds in storage. But I'm not even sure you could call them auto cannons because these guns were breech loaded.
Okay, first, what? Second, the
Yeah, turns out it's not much of a surprise that the Bismarck let frickin' biplanes get close enough to hit her with torpedoes, because big ol' Busy might as well have been slinging bolt actions for primary defense against fast-moving targets. For those of you who don't know enough about guns to process any of that, I need you to visualize this. Imagine you are trying to hit something flying at a speed of 1 to a few hundred miles an hour and probably not making it easy for you, so not flying in a straight line, turning, or flying lower than you could probably aim, with a gun. So bullets, you shoot them, they're gone, there's no guidance system, but you only get one bullet to shoot with at a time instead of a magazine or a belt feed with like 5, 10 or more. It's so unbelievably ridiculous that it's basically impossible. In practice, each gun's fire rate topped out at about 30 to 40 rounds per minute, about half their theoretical maximum. God forbid the Bismarck had to fight anything faster or she would have been sunk by lunch. And the gun mountings were also adapted from a land-based system that wasn't properly converted for oceanic conditions. So sometimes the mount seized up and you just couldn't swing the gun around. At this point, I'm starting to wonder if there were Russian designers involved in the making of the ship, because she's got a lot of AA commonality with the Moskva.
Why the f would anyone do that? Would you do that? Oh, exactly. God, this is getting on my nerves. I wish I could fucking kill you twice.
Arguably the most dependable AA guns she had were her 20 mics, the 12 MG-C30 guns in single mounts, and, added in late April 1941, 2 quad mounts of flak C38 guns. But while they had a large total ammo storage on board and a much more respectable fire rate, these guns were only loaded with 20-round magazines, which apparently wasn't an uncommon occurrence in any navy, but we all know more is better when it comes to bullets, so everyone kinda needed to get good. And before anyone says it, no, the Bismarck did not get time-fused high-explosive rounds for the main guns to shoot planes with. If she'd had those, she wouldn't have needed to shoot the ocean to scare off the incoming torpedo bombers later. Her sister ship, the Tirpitz, got some in April 1944, 3 years after Bismarck was already f***ing dead, but these seem to have been originally designed for airburst coastal artillery. They were allowed to use them for AA if they could somehow raise the guns high enough, but only if the other guns weren't enough to stop an incoming airstrike. Although, to be fair, that would be pretty damn often. And it's probably more likely that the Tirpitz was only issued that round because the AA complement was such complete shiza.
Series 4 deatomizer.
That's what I'm talking about.
Noisy cricket.
Weird side note, she apparently also had depth charges, which we know she wasn't maneuverable enough to use against subs. So the prevailing theory was that the Bismarck would use these to deceive enemy gunnery crews by creating false splashes to throw off the gunner's adjustments. However, these were literally never used, at least not intentionally, because apparently 3 of them got shook loose at one point when she fired her main guns. The only depth that was ever going to be charged in her case would be with the Bismarck herself, and she'd take plenty of gear with her, some of which was actually kind of impressive. Since we've been on about the firepower for a while, I think it's fitting we start with the means of controlling it. Busy could look around for targets using either her 4 Arado AR-196 float planes or her 3 Fumo-23 radars. The main radar way up top was twice the size of the others and used for search and navigation at a range of up to 25 kilometers, along with some degree of fire control. The one out back was a smaller and more limited backup for the rear guns only, and the other eyes front one down low was search only, and truthfully, both of them were basically just backups for the big one. And the reason they needed duplicate backup radars was because Germany's radars were dog shit. They hadn't invested into them as heavily by that point in the war as everyone else, so they needed all 3 of them for general redundancy. In particular, the radar readouts couldn't display more than one target at a time, and the bearings were usually way off. As a result, the Busy would rely much more heavily on her Zeiss optic suite, and I'm just gonna level with you here, the Zeiss optic was the best standalone optical targeting system of the entire Second World War. Granted, it probably only stayed that way because everyone else was like, why shoot at the horizon when I could just shoot over it, and hopped on the radar bandwagon.
This is brilliant, but I like this.
Yes, the Zeiss optic and the Fumo radars were connected for fire control, but the optic was the primary, and it made the 15-inch guns stupefyingly accurate. However, it was, as usual, so German engineered you need a damn clockmaker to fix it, and the backup sighting systems had several problems in testing where various connecting pins would break, right along with the gun elevation controls, which lacked any form of redundancy, or protection in some cases, because both the primary and secondary fire control cables moving targeting data from the range rangefinders to the fire control room were run down the outside of the ship, and for a noticeable portion of the upper superstructure were completely unprotected. Not only did this make them easy to shred like a metal guitar with enemy gunfire, music that King George and Rodney would be happy to play later, but Bismarck gun crews realized during the fighting and her retreat towards France that the shock from her guns firing would interrupt the data from the fire control system, basically making her blink whenever the enemy smiled for her 15-inch cameras.
Say cheese.
Thankfully, this seeming lack of foresight didn't extend to everything, and while her radars were awful, her sonars were actually phenomenal. She didn't have any active detection power, but she could listen for torpedoes and ships using her two Gruppenhochgerät or GHG hydrophone arrays, which were 60 microphone panels on each side of the hull. Because ironically, the Germans were actually way better at designing for submarine warfare than surface marine warfare, as evidenced by the Bismarck getting turned into one. No, but seriously, the Prinz Eugen sonar array could outrange some naval radars of the time in practice, and it would come in clutch during the Bismarck's first capital ship combat experience. In fact, in ideal conditions, the Bismarck sonar was expected to be able to pick out a target at 30 kilometers or 32,800 yards within a degree of accuracy. And the fact that Wereaboos don't latch onto that of all things as their primary height point really shows how little attention they pay to detail.
I really suck at this.
Interestingly, Busy also had one of the earliest and largest examples of an active protection system. Turns out the Germans were really sick of magnetic detonators. I guess we and the Brits hit them with that a lot the first time around, and because of that, they had what were called degaussing cables running from the front of the ship to the back. When activated, these cables would reduce or neutralize the magnetic polarity of the ship's hull to make it harder for torpedoes and magnetic mines to detect her and explode if she nosed into them, because the Mark 14 torpedoes just needed another reason to be completely less than useless. And speaking of noses, Busy got a nose job between launch and commissioning. She was originally built with a straight stem bow, but before she took to sea, she got some plastic or metal surgery for a raked back design called an Atlantic bow, because the Bismarck was pretty well known as a wet ship. And I don't mean after a good night, because the only laid the Bismarck was going to get was on the ocean floor. A wet ship is one that has a bad habit of taking a lot of water over the bow and onto the deck, and if Bismarck took on too much, it could flow over her deck and into the forward turret's electronics. And I think we can all agree that it's not very life-lengthening when your battleship likes to be a toaster in a bathtub. Imagine not being able to waterproof your ship. Busy eventually had to lose her front turret's rangefinders because of all the sea spray getting in their eyes. As such, the Atlantic bow was supposed to reduce how wet she got, but it never fully fixed her partying habits. Because while she was supposed to charge into some of those waves at a maximum design speed of 29 knots, during sea trials she achieved a maximum speed of just over 30 knots. That speed was thanks to her 12-paired Wagner boilers, powering 3 Bloom & Voss steam turbines, which produced a maximum obtained power output of 150,170 horsepower during sea trials as well. However, they could still put out enough RPMs for the props crews to turn almost as fast at max power as you'd get out of a destroyer, and about 1.5 times what you'd get from an Iowa class. That powertrain system also meant her 7,900 metric tons of fuel oil could push her and her over 2,200-man crew 9,280 nautical miles at a speed of 16 knots. But Busy wasn't an all-round speed racer. She was more like a dragster. The minute she tried to make a hard turn, she would bleed roughly 65% of her speed in the process.
Why so slow?
This was thanks primarily to her choice of rudder design. Busy came with smaller twin rudders instead of any larger single one, which were more streamlined and made her list less in the water at the cost of increased fluid drag in those hard turns. And they weren't there for redundancy either, because the Bismarck needed both rudders operational just to sail straight. If even one of them was offline, the ship would literally go with the flow because the waves would have more control of her ship than the helm did. And that was all still assuming the steering section stayed attached. The 3-propeller setup of German ships of the time also caused structural weaknesses in the stern, which could possibly cause the tip of the ship's ass end to crumple under its own weight. Not even enemy fire, its own goddamn weight could cause the butt cheeks to fall off like a rock off a cliff and and maybe take parts of the rudder and propulsion systems with it. And while it may not have happened to the Bismarck while it was alive, it did happen on the way down. That weakness was present, just as it was on other German ships with the same layout. But after a long period of several months of teething out some of these issues in testing, Bismarck would finally set sail for her first, and soon to be last, mission called Operation Rheinübung, or Exercise Rhine, on May 19, 1941. What was Exercise Rhine? Well, in the early years of the Second World War, before America entered the server, Britain was relying on American supplies being shipped overseas to stay in the war, and naturally, Germany wasn't a fan of that. So Germany decides to take away Britain's nice things, attack the enemy supply lines, break their backs, typical War 101 type of stuff. But there was a problem. The Brits also knew how important the supply convoys were, and they had a much bigger navy. So what they were doing was taking a bunch of their older battleships and attaching them to the convoy escorts to beat back any large surface raiders that came for the supplies, which also left all their newer battleships free to attack or defend as they deemed fit. The Germans didn't have enough big ships to mount a serious offensive on that big a set of floating bodyguards, and even if they did and won that fight, they were still only taking out one convoy at a time. Stack that next to America's wartime production putting Factorio to shame, and they're not doing much damage. So they needed to send single or small groups of ships at any given convoy. But a fight between them and even Britain's old big guns could still be a sinking stalemate. Moron Mustachio decided that the best way to do this was to put Germany's biggest guns forward, and so Bismarck, made to fight the French Navy, was sent out as a mere commerce raider under Captain Ernst Lindemann and the full command of Admiral Gunther Lütjens. And this man was the most gangster part of the entire ship. Yes, I know we're talking about a World War II German officer right now, but you will agree with me in just a minute. This man hated the Nazis and refused to do anything other than the original Reichsmarine salute while the ship was out at sea. Hell, he even gave the original salute to the mustache man himself, refusing the new one when he came aboard Bismarck for the first time. This is the picture. Look at this guy. He does not care about that man at all. He even ordered that the crooked cross on deck be painted over while at sea so he didn't have to look at it. Nobody's willing to give the Germans in World War II even the slightest bit of niceties, for good reason, but you gotta admit it's both mind-boggling and kinda cool to learn that a lot of the older naval officer corps also didn't care for the Pinwheel Party's antics on their own team. Additionally, Lütjens was probably the most qualified admiral Germany had, period. He was put in charge of the naval planning for the proposed British invasion plan, which never happened because Mustachio, and he had already led one raiding operation with the Kriegsmarine's newest battleships at the time, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. During that operation, which took out 22 convoy ships, his biggest takeaway was that the German battleship's speed advantage was very situational. This made the idea of using battleships as commerce raiders the worst gamble in the history of gambles, and Lütjens was far from thrilled about going out to do it again on a bigger floating target. But he doesn't really have a say in the matter, so he takes command anyways.
Christ, fine, I'll help you.
Bismarck was originally supposed to set sail with both Scharnhorst-class battleships and 2 heavy cruisers, but British bombing raids on the French coast had damaged all but Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, just 2 ships. But those supply convoys weren't gonna sink themselves, so the Germans sent them out anyways. The plan German HQ came up with was simple. Use the Bismarck's big guns to get the Brits' attention and bait their warships away from the convoys so Eugen could sink the supplies. Sounds pretty straightforward until it wasn't. The same day Busy leaves port, the 2 big ships and their accompanying destroyers ran into 2 different Swedish ships. While the Swedes were making trades with the Germans, they were officially neutral, and the intel in the fleet movement would be quickly handed off to the British. Combined with British intelligence catching wind of extra personnel and navigation charts requests giving away an upcoming Atlantic raid, and British forces would start by scrambling photo recon Spitfires to go look for the German ships. On May 21st, one British recon aircraft would fly overhead as the Germans approached the Norwegian coast. The Germans spotted it but had no fighter cover. Something Hermann Göring hated the Kriegsmarine, so the best they could do was watch it, wait for it to leave, and start repainting the ship's turret identification colors to a dark gray for better camouflage against the Atlantic Ocean. However, they would have to put into port at Grimstad Fjord for that, and despite having 2 Luftwaffe planes as cover, on May 21st, a British RAF Spitfire PR-3 from the 1st Photo Recon Unit unit would snap high-quality pictures of the fleet from 26,000 feet while they were refueling. Upon receiving that intelligence, Britain immediately scrambled 2 warships from their available home fleet ships to hunt down the Bismarck, those being the 14-inch gun-armed King George V class battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the pride of the Royal Navy, the 15-inch gun-armed battlecruiser HMS Hood. Both ships were very powerful, but they also both had problems in the most opposite of ways. The Prince of Wales was too new and the Hood was too old. Wales had basically come straight out of the builder's yard and wasn't fully tested yet. Meanwhile, Hood hadn't been updated or refitted in about 6 years, which is ancient for a ship. She was running on so many patchwork repairs that her gas tanks might as well have been full of hopes and dreams.
We're running on fumes!
Fumes!
The other 2 ships of the home fleet, the actual King George V battleship and the Royal Navy flagship, along with the aircraft carrier Victorious, were set to Alert 5 and ready for launch from harbor. Meanwhile, Bismarck and Eugen would leave the Norwegian port without their destroyers, probably both because the destroyers couldn't stay out late before Mama Ocean stopped them dead in the water with an empty gas tank, and maybe to confuse future recon looking for a bigger fleet group. On the evening of May 22nd, Bismarck and Eugen, who had been dodging ice floes through low-visibility fog, detected a British ship on sonar and radar following them at about 14,000 yards. The British heavy cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk, who had been patrolling the Denmark Strait for German activity, had received orders from the British Admiralty to shadow Bismarck until they could get more ships in position. Of those 2, Suffolk was now right behind Busy and had somehow snuck up well within Bismarck's firing range. Even worse, Prinz Eugen was reading active radio transmissions from the Suffolk, meaning that she was reporting her position to someone and, by extension, theirs.
He's gonna give us away!
But because of that distance, Busy's main guns were probably looking at Suffolk like an afternoon snack, and since Suffolk didn't feel like being eaten alive by German lead, she would instead opt to retreat to a safe distance, where she was later joined by her sister ship, the Norfolk. However, then it was Norfolk's turn to get too close, and Busy, who had already let one ship off with a warning, wasn't about to give the Brits a second chance and let loose her first shells in anger of the war. The twin Brits, naturally not in the mood to be a submarine today, would back off after a few salvos, making a smokescreen to retreat and reporting the Germans' last known position and sailing order. And this is where things start to get funny, because while the Bismarck was the only ship to fire her guns, she was also the only ship to lose something.
What is your damage?
I haven't taken any damage! That's the problem!
Turns out Busy's guns were almost as dangerous to her as they were to her enemies, because the shock force of her first salvo knocked out her own main radar, poked out her own eyes with the recoil of her own guns. Clearly no one ever taught her proper firing stance. As it turns out, the radar equipment had actually been added to the ship after the firing trials were completed, and somehow nobody had thought of the necessity of shock testing the new equipment. So now Bismarck can't see past the horizon, and Prinz Eugen has to take the lead. They would turn back for another pass at the Brits, but the British radars weren't built like a glass window, and they got the hell out of the way, positioning themselves off the formation's rear to continue updating the incoming British battleships on position. However, the commanding officer aboard HMS Hood, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, only had the rough positions of the German ships. Because of how far back the 2 cruisers had to stay in trail, they didn't know about the change of formation, because how would they know that the Bismarck was made so poorly that her first rounds would blow out her own f***ing eyes? So Holland had planned to have the capital ship shoot the leading ship, who they thought was Bismarck, and the cruisers shoot the trailing ship, who they thought was Eugen, in a very convenient 2-on-1 type equal battle. So when the British caught up to the German group on May 24th, they had no idea the German ships had traded places. And making things worse, because they had expected their transmissions to be intercepted, they didn't radio the cruisers and had just hoped they would magically be close enough to charge in after making contact. Unmagically, however, Norfolk and Suffolk were not close enough, leaving the 2 British capital ships, one untested and one outdated, to fight the 2 full-fledged German warships on their own. Worse still, the Suffolk had lost track of the Bismarck earlier, so while Holland had guessed the German path correctly and still managed to get closer as he wanted, he was out of the position he had hoped for when they finally made contact. But Holland wanted to engage the Bismarck anyways, even without the support, and he decided to send it. The Prinz Eugen detected Hood's engine screws at 20 nautical miles, the Prince of Wales lookout spotted the Germans at 15 nautical miles, and within a few short minutes, the fight was on.
Time to go to work.
At 5:52 in the morning, Hood would take the first shot at 26,500 yards with her 15-inch guns, followed shortly by Prince of Wales and her 14-inch battery, each ship firing on a different target. However, because they were firing on the lead ship, Eugen, instead of Bismarck, it would take a few minutes for the Hood to realize they were shooting at the smaller of the two boats and remedy that situation double time. And another problem was that the Hood needed to get closer so its thin deck armor didn't eat a shell falling out of the sky, forcing the Brits to basically run straight at the German ships and limit their available firepower to only the frontal turrets for the first few minutes. But instead of taking advantage of this window of opportunity, the German guns stayed silent. Lütjens initially refused to give permission to fire because his orders were to hold fire unless it was necessary to destroy a shipping convoy, and these were battleships. In addition, he also felt more concerned about the two British cruisers lagging behind them, and if I had to guess why, he knew they were being followed, so he was probably expecting the British to come fight them with way more than just two ships. And when that was all he got, he thought it was some kind of trap or ambush. Meanwhile, the Brits turned their paths just enough to fire another salvo from each ship, this time full broadsides. The Prince of Wales shots straddle big ol' Busy like a kinky girlfriend, but Lütjens denies permission to fire yet again. However, Lütjens isn't the only commanding officer on the Bismarck. Captain Lindemann, realizing they're about to have his ship dialed and not wanting to sit there and be sunk, would step forward and issue his famous line, "I will not have my ship shot out from under my ass. Return fire." And at 5:55, Bismarck would raise the signal to target the lead British ship, and both metal monsters on the German side would open fire.
What I understand is I'm about to pound you so hard the boy's mother is going to be jealous.
After a quick exchange, the Prince of Wales would score first blood on the Bismarck's bow, although Prince Eugen would quickly return the favor and convert one of Hood's ready-use AA magazines into a Chinese fireworks factory. Both sides would continue to trade hits for the next few minutes, with Prince of Wales striking the Bismarck on the hull below the waterline and both German ships slapping Hood, with Bismarck nailing the fire control tower and Eugen turning a couple hundred AA operators into Boeing whistleblowers. However, the Germans had only been shooting at Hood up to now, who for some reason was forgetting that she had 4 more guns in the back seat and it was doing her no favors. Those forward turrets couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, and they certainly hadn't hit anyone yet. Wales, meanwhile, had shot the Bismarck twice now despite one of her guns malfunctioning. What's the saying? Hit me once, shame on you. Hit me twice, shame on me. Wait, that's not how it goes. Anyways, it was at that point that Lütjens decides he's had enough of all that accurate gunnery bullshit and signals Eugen to start punching holes in Wales.
Trumpets!
I'm getting real tired of this shit. You and me both.
2 minutes later, Wales would respond to that insult with another gun jam, and a third round sank into Busy. So now Busy's pissed. She's been hit 3 times and landed 1 shot, which means she's down on the leaderboard 3-1, and she can't have that. So she's about to take all that anger out on the first thing she sees, and that thing is Hood. At 6 a.m., after 8 minutes of combat, Bismarck would put herself on the leaderboard's top. According to the captain of the Prince of Wales, one of Bismarck's shells landed on Hood somewhere about the mainmast, and after about a second or two, that hit was followed by a massive geyser of flame and then an even larger detonation. If the crew accounts on the order of detonations are to be believed, then it is most likely that the shell landed in the auxiliary magazine for the 4-inch AA guns, which would detonate and blow its way into the powder room for turret 3. The resulting explosion would shear the Hood in half, sinking her so quickly the crew on the bridge didn't realize she was going down until the front half had already rolled halfway over. Bismarck herself even had so much trouble processing the Brit was going down that she even fired a few more salvos in fog of war.
Okay. People are dead.
Bismarck would then change targets to Wales, with both German ships now firing both primary and secondary guns. Wales would take a total of 7 hits over the next few minutes, 3 below the waterline and 1 into both the fire control tower and the bridge, turning almost everyone there into paste. One of these shells would penetrate far below the waterline into the hull and bury itself there without exploding, but not because it was a dud. While duds in German shells weren't uncommon, they also weren't designed to travel through that much water before penetrating something, and the ocean ended up disengaging the shell's fuse, which was arguably pretty lucky for Wales, because if that shell had gone off that close to her keel, she probably would have had her back blown out, and not in the fun way. In the meantime, Norfolk would finally get within range to engage, but she would miss all her shots, and then Prince Eugen would pick up a torpedo in its passive sonar, which was confirmed by an onboard officer. Where that torpedo came from, nobody knows, but given that Hood was the only ship in the engagement with torpedo tubes, it was probably a last you from her. Bismarck would be alerted, both ships would dodge, and that evasive maneuver gave Wales just enough breathing room to make smoke and run. So to sum up, the Brits half stumbled into a fight with Bismarck and friend, the pride of their navy is down, and the last one's been beaten half to death, so now the Germans get to figure out what they're gonna do next. Lindemann was like, that other battleship is almost dead, plus it knows where we are, we should sink it. But Lutyens responds with something to the effect of, no, our orders are to sink the supply convoy, and I have no idea how we're gonna do that with the British up our ass. Also, our intelligence is garbage because HQ told me that the ship we just sunk was in fucking Africa, so we clearly don't even know where the enemy is now, and we got hit with a couple of the cordless hole punchers.
They got me good.
As they had just seen, the Prince of Sniper Rifles earlier had shot Busy 3 times, with one round punching through one of Bismarck's aircraft hangars, another through a fuel tank in the nose, and the third through the base of the Turtleback into a boiler room. Had that landed a little more to the side, the Bismarck might not have been anywhere near as famous because it might have struck a 6-inch magazine, which, remember, are right next to the engine boilers.
Kinda comes off as an intentional design flaw if you ask me.
She was now down a float plane, an aircraft catapult, and significantly worse, a few knots of speed. The bow strike had also opened an unwanted trade route between the gas tank and the Atlantic Ocean, selling fuel oil for 2,000 tons of seawater. Trade might be good for prosperity, but this one, not so much, because the Bismarck had left the Norway already about 12,000 tons short on liquid cash. So the Bismarck would have to pay up front in the form of reduced effective range and even lower speed, turning her from a wet ship into a wet dream. And it created a surprise tool that'll help the British later. Speaking of the British, the Norfolk and Suffolk were still following her, now with the Prince of Wales in tow, which Busy couldn't outrun because of the flooding damage. As she had charged away from the fighting, the flooding would force the ship to list forwards, eventually pushing the back end so high up that one of her prop screws was sticking out of the water. Naturally, being a lowrider doesn't work nearly as well in the water, so they gotta fix that pronto, along with the gas tanks up front, which the ship had to briefly slow down to fix and allowed the Brits to stay in trail. Worse still, the oil slick she was leaking was wider than the Prinz Eugen and stretched for several miles, making the ship look
like it's a fucking dartboard.
Lutyens, now aware he is missing several important pieces, decides to officially abort the mission and report the battle to HQ, which responds by ordering Eugen to continue the mission without them. But getting to port would be a separate story because the British followed them pretty much the whole way they came from. Trying to go back the way they came would be like trying to get out of a ball pit, except the balls are made of metal and trying to shoot you. Lutyens may have had some of the biggest guns on the water, but remember, the Brits had outnumbered the Kriegsmarine before the Bismarck was built, and that wasn't supposed to change until 1945. And the Bismarck had basically just got done with kicking the Brits' favorite puppy down a flight of stairs. He knows there will be no glorious battlefield ride for home. If he gets caught out by anybody, he is going to get hit with everything in the kitchen sink, and that'll just be the beginning of it.
This ain't that kind of movie, bruv.
And he didn't know it, but he was absolutely right, because the British had basically turned around every battleship they had available and a few of the ones they didn't to go beat the Bismarck under the water. A total of 60 warships, including half of Britain's active capital ship fleet, were sent after this one German boat to make sure she didn't make it home. Busy didn't kick the hornet's nest, she got the attention of an entire school of the animal kingdom, because it really says something when you piss off the Brits so bad they decide they're gonna beat you until the only place you can retreat is downwards. You touch their boat and now they're gonna remind you where America gets it from. All I'm saying is that when you get the tea drinkers to set down the fine china and pull out the pint glass and say, watch this, you know you done goofed. So instead of going back through the boat pit of doom, Lutyens would decide to make for the next best port on the French coast. But Prinz Eugen still needed a way to get out to hit those supply convoys they were ordered to sink in the first place, which she was very likely to succeed in now because the Bismarck was going to make a great distraction. But Lutyens somehow had to get her out there without the Brits realizing she'd be by herself, which never goes well against a British hornet's nest post-kick. Sailing into a rainstorm didn't do the work because the British cruisers had radar that didn't break under the weight of their own gunfire. So the Bismarck said, fine, I'll do it myself, turns around and beelines it straight at the three pursuers. This scares the holy shit out of the heavy cruisers and forces them to break off, while the Prince of Wales, who already shot the Bismarck 3 times now, went,
"Oh shit, here we go again."
and the two would exchange the wrong kind of digits yet again, this time with no hits to either side. This maneuver would work perfectly, with Prinz Eugen gone like a fart in the wind and the Bismarck making full steam out of there. And despite her damage, she was still going so fast that she was actually outrunning most of the Royal Navy. In fact, only the two older ships Renown and Repulse would be able to get in position to engage Bismarck at all. And even 2 against 1, the loss of the hood made them cautious, so they didn't want to get into a chasing gunfight the Bismarck could probably repeat and win. The British had to slow her down. So Admiral Tovey, commanding all the British naval forces from King George V and now personally in charge of this mission, ordered the only thing he had that could outrun a battleship to attack: his aircraft carrier. Not the carrier specifically, but its torpedo bombers, the Swordfish biplanes, aka the string bags. The aircraft carrier Victorious is with him and his flagship, so he takes it off the leash and tells it to go fetch. Unfortunately, the string dogs got the Bismarck's attention early by almost friendly firing Norfolk and a US Coast Guard cutter that just happened to be there. Because fun fact, while Uncle Sam wasn't in the war yet, the Coast Guard was out running what they called neutrality patrols, basically running convoy escort while double daring Germany to shoot them and add America to its ass-whooping list.
See how that goes.
But eventually, the Swordfish found the actual target and made their runs on Bismarck, with busy firing literally everything back at these biplanes. They might not have had those time fuse shells, but they were still firing the main guns, using regular high-explosive rounds to create water plumes, which would hopefully either throw off an attack run or maybe use the rest of their luck early and blow a string bag out of the sky. But she didn't shoot any of them down because, as we mentioned earlier, her AA defenses were about as effective as a hybridization between Swiss cheese and a condom. So all 9 of the Swordfish biplanes escaped, but only one of their torpedoes hit, and it did basically no damage because it hit right where the protection was thickest. Ironically, the evasive maneuvers Busy took to dodge the other 8 did more damage than the hit, because it loosened some of the damage control measures they'd used to bring the damaged boiler room back online, causing it to flood and be locked out until they could fix it again, temporarily almost cutting their speed in half. This brief lapse in speed would cause Busy to drift into gun range of the Prince of Wales again, causing the two to exchange numbers for a third time, again with no hits.
Jeez, get a room, you two.
However, she would eventually pick back up and get back out of range, and pretty soon afterwards, her pursuers would suddenly start zigzagging across the water. Out here on the open Atlantic, U-boats could literally be anywhere, so the Brits broke up their travel path to avoid being easy shots. However, when they were at their farthest point in the zigzag, the Bismarck was also just barely out of their radar detection envelope, and at the right moment, Lütjens ordered the ship hard to starboard, looping back over her own wake. And on the morning of May 25th, the Bismarck would escape towards France behind her previous pursuers.
How'd it go with Navy? Hey, where'd you go?
It is after that point that the already stinking hot mess turns into a complete shit show on both sides. Lütjens, thinking the British might still be on his tail, sends a radio transmission to German HQ to update them on his status. This transmission gives away his position to the British, but the crew aboard King George, however, somehow manages to plug in the coordinates the wrong way, making them think she's going back towards the Denmark Strait. It took somebody almost half a day for them to realize they did it wrong, and in the meantime, Bismarck is just booking it for France. However, this wild ship chase would yet again prove to be the naval equivalent of you can outrun the cop car but you can't outrun a radio, because the Brits would then get an update from intelligence and French resistance about the Luftwaffe moving units to give the Bismarck some air cover on her way in. So now the Brits know exactly which port the Bismarck is going to, which isn't great for the Bismarck because it was already a gamble for them to be going there in the first place. So they radioed 209 Squadron of RAF Coastal Command, a Catalina flying boat squadron in Northern Ireland, to come down and help them find this thing. And on the 26th of May, the Bismarck would eventually be spotted by a Catalina flown by British pilot Dennis Briggs and, unusually, an American co-pilot, Navy Ensign Leonard Tuck Smith. So there was at least one American involved in the sinking of the Bismarck, and it was the guy holding the camera and yelling "World Star," par for the course. So good news is, they know where she is. Bad news is, they're still way the off course because somebody put the coordinates in backwards, meaning that the Bismarck would reach friendly air cover long before they could get into position. And because they had rerouted a bunch of their fleet from existing missions, most of them didn't have enough gas to make a prolonged chasing trip. So the only big ships able to keep pursuing the Bismarck were the battleships King George, Renown, and Rodney, and the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. And the Ark Royal was the only one that could reach out and touch the Bismarck in time, so more torp strikes it was. The Ark Royal would send out her torpedo planes to attack the Bismarck while the light cruiser HMS Sheffield moved to shadow her.
Let's go.
So the Ark Royal sends her planes out to go torp the Bismarck, but again, the British proved to be a friendly fire magnet because the string bags went after the Sheffield instead because apparently they didn't know she was supposed to be there. However, by some miracle, and by miracle I mean the sheer extent of this absolute cluck, this turned out to be the absolute best case ending for that sortie. First of all, the torpedoes pulled a Mark 14 and none of the magnetic detonators worked, causing every single torpedo to blow up early far away from the Sheffield. And second, the Sheffield somehow managed to restrain her crew from blowing away the Swordfish with an actually useful AA battery.
Open fire, damn it!
So the only thing harmed on the Sheffield were the sailors' pants, and the string bags were also saved the trouble of making a completely useless torpedo run against the Bismarck into enemy fire. So the biplanes go back to the carrier, probably pissing themselves a little over pulling a William D. Porter, and they got rearmed with working torps to go out and do it again. But the stakes are way higher for this run, because this is the last shot they have before it gets dark. If they don't do something here, the Bismarck will make it into friendly territory and escape. They have to hit her and hit her hard now. So 15 string bags take off and they can't find the Bismarck. They know where the Sheffield is and they're probably keeping their hands a little further from the drop switches this time so they don't shoot her, and Sheffield calls out the bearing for the biplanes to go after. Sheffield almost gets shot by the Bismarck for getting a little too close, but Busy would quickly find herself with too many problems to worry about adding more tea to the ocean, because ironically those salvos were exactly what told the Swordfish pilots where she was. The Swordfish would actually end up charging the ship from so low on the deck that the 105s couldn't aim low enough. But that didn't seem to stop the Germans from shooting anyways. Shrapnel would find its way into every plane and crew, but the pilots didn't flinch. Every pilot knew they needed this miracle, and so none of the string bags turned back, and they all charged at the Bismarck's port side as Busy would crank it hard to port, turning into her enemy's attack run to defend. Bismarck would take 3 torpedo hits from this run, 2 to the middle and 1 to the rear. The 2 to the middle did little to no damage, but the third one was exactly the miracle they were looking for. That torpedo was dropped by Swordfish pilot and naturally Scotsman Charles Jock Moffat, who landed his shot thanks to his observer Dusty Miller physically leaning out of the bomber to gauge the wave height, which sounds absolutely insane until you realize that Miller knew that if you didn't drop the torpedo into the bottom or trough of a wave, it could get thrown off course, and he was visually checking the waves as they were charging into this metal hailstorm to make their shot count. Miller may have been the observer in that situation, but Bismarck was about to observe the size of his nuts. These Swordfish pilots are out here just trying to survive a literal storm of steel to make manifest a literal act of God, and meanwhile the Flying Scotsman and company are trying to land a trick shot. And luckily for them, between the last-ditch timing of this attack and the congregation of physics that made Moffat's torpedo hit, God himself wanted this ship dead. Moffat's torpedo didn't hit the Bismarck on the side of the stern, it went just under the back, just behind the rudders, only to get curved upwards into the bottom of the hull by the vortex wake of the propellers. The resulting explosion would wreck the out of the hull, break the port rudder's control shaft, aka the one on the complete opposite side of the hit, and damn near obliterate the starboard rudder. Not only did the torp straight up remove between a quarter to a half of the starboard rudder's back end and the entire supporting structure for the shaft itself, it also took that rudder and the shaft it was mounted to and deformed the ship until the blast had physically relocated both of them almost 10 feet forward and to the left of where they were supposed to be, which meant that the front of the rudder, which was angled away from the centerline propeller, was now in the propeller's path of travel, which naturally resulted in the prop screw chewing the rudder apart until a whole propeller blade broke off in the rudder itself.
I have a question. For God.
Look at that picture. That is the right rudder being viewed from the left side side because the left rudder apparently fell off halfway down. Granted, that's not a very clear image, but to give you a sense of how much damage that torpedo probably did, this is one of the Italian Littorio-class battleships we mentioned earlier after a hit from the same kind of torpedo in roughly the same position. Talk about a backshot. Crew reports note that the engines and boilers powering the middle screw started vibrating horrendously after the torpedo hit, causing them to shut them off to prevent the ship from shaking itself apart, which was a very real hazard given that the 3-screw design of the ship ran the risk of the entire ass end falling off under its own weight. The crew managed to get what was left of the starboard rudder back online, but the port rudder was a lost cause. And since Busy needed both rudders to avoid subscribing to a wave-based steering system, and the one that's jammed has more surface area left of it than the one that isn't, the Flying Scotsman has now officially converted the Bismarck to the world's largest NASCAR racer. Some crew members suggested using explosives to blow the jammed rudder off the ship entirely, but Lutjens refused because the amount of boom required could breach the hull or even break the engine shafts. With control of the ship lost, Lutjens would send one final transmission to German HQ. Ship unmaneuverable, we will fight to the last gun, long live the Führer. Which sounds patriotic and all, but it really isn't because those were actually the standing orders for the Kriegsmarine since 1939.
Elaborate.
Back in 39, the heavy cruiser Admiral Graf Spee had been chased into a corner in the neutral port of Montevideo in Uruguay from the Spanish coast. However, she was only able to stay there for 24 hours because it was a neutral port, and the British knew that the Germans were intercepting their radio comms. So the Brits did what Brits do and saw an opportunity for a bit of trolling. One of the British light cruisers that had chased her, Ajax, sent out a radio signal saying they were going to retreat to rejoin a task force made from the battlecruiser Renown and the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, except neither one of those ships was actually there. But the captain of the Graf Spee didn't know that, and after he convened with the German HQ about his options, he was given two choices. One, make it to Argentina, which was friendly with Germany and would hold onto their ship for them, or two, sink it herself. The captain knew he wasn't making it past a battlecruiser, and especially not an aircraft carrier. I mean, let's be honest, those 3.7s weren't saving anyone. But scuttling a ship was like burning your own house to the ground, and doing so in neutral territory in a corner would leave his crew as prisoners of war. However, many of his crew were also wounded and needed medical attention. And if he just surrendered the ship, the British, who were more friendly with Uruguay, would force the ship into Uruguayan hands and inspect it with their own intelligence before outright taking it. So the captain struck a deal with the mayor of Montevideo. Montevideo would allow the crew to leave the German ship and receive medical treatment, and in exchange, they would leave the war and become non-combatants. The mayor of the port town accepted, and the following morning, the Graf Spee would sail out towards the British fleet before detonating just outside the mouth of the harbor. This probably marked the only case where the British tricked a ship into scuttling itself and gave the mustache man the idea that all German ships should fight to the last gun rather than be lost to British trickery.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
And now that order is about to apply to Bismarck because she is alone. Almost. See, while Germany had responded to the Bismarck's report by ordering all available submarines to assist, none of them would make it to Busy before the British did. The only submarine within range to help at all was U-556. Who was actually more than willing. As fate would have it, during U-556's commissioning, she had been denied permission to borrow the port's band for her send-off. So Captain Lindemann, being an absolute homie about it, had loaned her the Bismarck's band instead, to which the captain of that sub, Herbert Wohlfarth, swore that he would come to the Bismarck's aid should she ever need it. And right now, she had perfect shots at Ark Royal and Repulse. But she had no torpedoes left, leaving the sub's captain gnashing his teeth over both a missed perfect shot and the inability to keep his promise. So a one-man last stand fight to the death it was, and the now crippled Bismarck would begin steaming into a circle into the night. She would fire on Sheffield one more time, this time taking out her radar and forcing Sheffield to withdraw. But where one Royal Navy ship falters, 5 more take its place apparently, and 5 British destroyers would trade places with Sheffield to make up the Royal Navy Hydra. While these destroyers were only supposed to keep an eye on Busy, Busy's ready to fight and she's gonna shoot somebody, and well, the destroyers are now closest. What was supposed to be the 1940s version of a Netflix watch party turned into guerrilla warfare on the high seas, with the destroyers making hit-and-run passes at Busy with shells, torpedoes, and star clusters. Their strategy was just to generally harass the German ship all night long, draining the crew's energy and their ammunition. And one of the destroyers taking part in these hit-and-run tactics would be the Free Polish ship ORP Piorun, which would drive with Poland's standard default aggressive National Revenge edition and operate almost independently of the British ships. The Piorun would charge to 13,500 yards before firing 3 salvos and everything else, after which the Bismarck missed her with a salvo by 20 yards and forced her to make smoke and run. And the entire time she was swinging at Bismarck, she was using her signal lights to scream at this battleship over and over again the words, "I am a Pole." The Brits even thought at one point that the Poles might try and ram Bismarck, and I don't blame them, because I don't know what's crazier, the fact that this destroyer had the balls to straight up bum rush the biggest battleship Germany had, or the fact that it survived charging the Bismarck like a Florida man with its pants off, screaming "Witness me" the entire time. There were even reports of the Polish crew shooting at the Bismarck with their pistols and rifles despite being well out of range, literally trying to hit them with everything but the kitchen sink and making a picture-perfect rendition of the British attitude for the rest of the fight. By the morning of the 27th, the British big ships began closing in, and while Bismarck was still returning mostly accurate fire, the Brits could tell that she'd been clapped under the right ass cheek so hard she couldn't sail straight anymore. The British crews had also been at action stations all night long and they were tired, but they were also fueled by revenge, and they could tell they were about to have it. Lütjens had radioed German high command for a U-boat to come pick up his war logs, which they had been unable to fly out earlier as they normally would, thanks to the Prince of Wales kissing her on the aircraft catapult in round 1. U-556 was running low on gas, and so U-74 would be given the wartime DoorDash order instead, but the British would get there first.
Let's drop some lead on those motherfuckers!
Starting at 8:47 a.m., the Nelson-class battleship Rodney and then King George V would kick off the Bismarck's final moments by opening fire with their big guns at about 22,000 yards. Rodney said, "I sent you my 16-inch shells, please respond," and 2 minutes later, Bismarck did. Busy would try to cancel her oceanic steering subscription for half a second, but failed, and the 2 big British guns would split up to divide her fire and start broadsiding Busy. Norfolk would join the fray, finally getting to reply to those insults from the days before, and Rodney would almost take a hit from Bismarck that still jammed a torpedo tube from the shock, but otherwise, she'd be fine. Rodney would continue airdropping 16-inch comments while her captain, embodying the phrase "youth and exuberance is no match for old age and treachery," would make slight alterations after each of Bismarck's shots, dodging every salvo by a hair's breadth. Busy, likely remembering some old adage about an old man where men die young, then changed targets to King George. Soon the ships are close enough to start slinging secondary shells, and the bullet-to-air ratio starts getting so close to 1 that people on all sides actually start having an easier time figuring out which shells want to know their location. And with such a high-calorie, force-fed diet of lead, the Bismarck would finally start taking hits from the Brits. One of Rodney's 16-inch replies went straight for the throat and penetrated the main conning tower, taking out the bridge crew, the entire chain of command, and the ship's primary fire control director all in one shot, effectively decapitating the ship and blinding the forward guns.
I've got good news. You see, there's no need to wonder where your God is, because he's right here, and he's fresh out of mercy.
To be fair, it is hotly debated whether it was a 14-inch shell from Georgie or a 16-inch round from Rodney, but honestly, doesn't really matter. The shell hit, and if so facto, everyone's dead. Oh, and just a reminder, the conning tower was armored with 350 millimeters of armor, which we know got penetrated and was bigger than the belt armor. And there were 2 shells that penetrated the belt armor itself, so if anybody out there really wants to go off about the Busy's armor being invincible, I have no idea what you're on about.
I just fought you and I think you're quite vincible.
As if to prove the point that the Bismarck's armor was damn near irrelevant to battleships, then another 16-inch round from Rodney screamed in and punched Busy's Bruno turret square square in the face, converting that sloped turret turtleback up top into a front door and detonating inside the gun housing, where, again, for some reason, the Germans decided to put an ammunition ready rack. This shot naturally lights that ammunition off, and the resulting explosion blasts the backplate of the turret clean off, ejecting it like a Chinese car battery and giving the Anton turret a knockout case of percussive maintenance. The cruiser Dorsetshire would also join the fight, and by that point so many shells were flying through the air, people started losing track of what shot what, with one of Busy's 6-inch turrets pulling a magic trick and disappearing under the weight of lead. Busy's Caesar and Dora turrets trained themselves on George V, but right as they pulled range, old Georgie would remind them that only one can be king and absolutely dome her remaining radar crown while barely missing the people working underneath it. I can only imagine that must be what it's like to have a tornado tear the roof off your house. The back turrets would individually retrain on Rodney, who was now firing every single gun she could range Bismarck with. The next several minutes would basically just be composed of pretty much every British ship taking the Bismarck to Pound Town in their own caliber of way, lighting more than its soul on fire and making all kinds of new holes to shove their payloads into. Soon, turret Dora would have a premature event within one of her barrels and knock herself out, and within a few more minutes, King George and Rodney were just circling Busy like sharks at point-blank range and shooting clean through the German ship. Anton would pull itself together and fire one last round before a crewmate aboard Rodney would notice something unusual. A German sailor got up on top of the blown-out Bruno turret, waving his arms at Rodney as if to get their attention. Then a black flag was raised over the ship, followed by people using the signal lamps to communicate a desire to parley. Basically the crew saying, "Hey, can we talk? We can tell we're gonna lose." But when informed, the artillery officer basically told the crewmate, "I don't want to hear it." And as if to make his point, a 16-inch round impacted the Bruno turret just below where the German was standing. And he just kind of froze there in shock because he had now clearly received the British message.
We do not care.
It's also possible they thought it was a trap because, well, Caesar turret and the others were still shooting, though not for long. Caesar would take several hits and go down, and in the meantime, the surviving German command staff would order the flooding of a burning magazine, drowning several sailors who went to try and save some of their peers. The mainmast would topple soon after while secondary batteries continued firing, and Busy was quickly being reduced to a burning scrap heap. But with no visible surrender flag and the perceived idle threat of U-boats, the British would continue shooting, now firing shells so low they left shockwaves visible on the ocean behind them, trying to sink this ship already riding low in the water in 13 to 20 foot sea state 6 waves. The weather arguably ate more shells for the Bismarck than the Turtleback did, and yet, despite the Turtleback's complete irrelevance, the British had spent lead on Busy's sinking fund for over an hour with no noticeable return on investment. An estimated mere 10% of the over 2,000 medium caliber shells actually hit the Bismarck from only a few miles away, and it got to the point that by 9:30 in the morning, Admiral Tovey had told King George's captain, "Get closer, I do not see enough hits."
Drive me closer. I want to hit them with my sword.
15 minutes later, Rodney swapped to firing torpedoes and full broadsides, while the cruiser HMS Dorsetshire fired torpedoes of her own. A few of these torpedoes hit, and while their damage is unconfirmed, Rodney's shots would still be the only documented cases of a battleship-on-battleship torpedo engagement. And I say documented because we don't have any official confirmation that Hood was the one who fired the torpedo at Bismarck and Eugen in the Denmark Strait. Another wave of Swordfish bombers finally got off the Ark Royal's deck to engage, but the only thing they really got to do was get shot at by King George V's AA because I guess the Brits forgot they were the only ones crazy enough to mainstream naval biplanes in the 40s. However, the British would finally begin to cease fire, primarily because they were in need of fuel to make sure they could make it back, and any ships with remaining torpedoes were ordered to use them. Some German sailors had waited for the firing to stop to begin their escape from the sinking hulk, and only after the Dorsetshires torpedoes struck did the Bismarck finally roll over and capsize, sinking beneath the waves at 10:39 a.m. More than 400 hits had been scored on Bismarck by some 2,800 rounds fired over the course of the battle. Unfortunately for some German sailors, though, the Dorsetshire, who was sent to pick up survivors, spotted U-74 approaching to pick up the war logs, which scared them into believing a submarine attack was imminent and led them to prioritize the safety of their ship. They would break away from the perceived threat, leaving many German sailors to slowly freeze in the cold Atlantic. Of the more than 2,000-strong crew, between 700 and 800 of them actually managed to make it overboard, and only 116 of them were saved. But to any who would use that to question the sense of honor between sailors, then I offer you the fact that when one of the Germans died of their wounds aboard the Dorsetshire, he was buried at sea with the Kriegsmarine flag, not the spicy German one, and full military honors. Back in Britain, Admiral Tovey would later write to the Admiralty that the Bismarck had put up a most gallant fight against impossible odds, worthy of the old days of the Imperial German Navy, as she went down with her colors still flying.
You fought a good fight. Stay down.
However, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, because the Admiralty was apparently considering court-martialing Captain Leach from the Prince of Wales, because he decided to run from the German fleet after the loss of Hood in the Denmark Strait, which is just stupid. If he'd done that, they probably would have lost 2 capital ships instead of 1, and possibly lost track of Bismarck when she doubled back and scared the piss out of Norfolk and Suffolk so Prince Eugen could get away. Tovey heard about this, and he was so horrified he threatened to resign from his post and defend Leach in court. To no one's surprise, that idea was never heard again. But on Busy's side of the war, the questions were just as stupid. Moron Mustachio, really about to earn that name with this one, demanded to know from Admiral Rader why Lütjens hadn't tried to finish off the Prince of Wales even at the cost of the Bismarck, giving him the propaganda leverage of 2 battleships, A, completely forgetting that kill counts don't win battles, objectives do, and B, for some reason being willing to throw away the giant propaganda symbol he'd made such a big fucking deal out of. Makes no sense. With that level of stupid, I'm surprised he didn't blame the sinking on the ship's cat, later named Oscar by the Brits who fished him out of the water aboard the HMS Cossack. This cat would stay aboard Cossack and later Ark Royal, all of which sank, although the cat survived all 3 ships and earned the nickname Unsinkable Sam. But back to Mustache Face. Since the guy was a walking incarnation of anger issues, he would take the loss of the Bismarck personally and withdraw all heavy surface fleet units from convoy hunting in the Atlantic. And that is not the end of the video, because as much as I'd love to end it here, I still have one more fire as stupid to put out. The Bismarck was scuttled before it sank, so the British can't claim they sank the Bismarck. It sank itself. I was really hoping you would just shut up and walk away, but that's mostly because I like not losing my voice. And in short, the evidence proving that is debatable. First of all, we should explain what scuttling is. Scuttling is the action of using small explosive charges to blow open the doors to all watertight compartments to expedite flooding and sink a ship faster. The only reason the Graf Spee exploded was probably because some of those charges were likely placed in the ammo rooms to make the otherwise perfectly good ship sink. And with the definitions out of the way, let's go ahead and start with the assumption that somehow this minuscule detail would have made even the slightest difference in her survival rate. The idea that the ship was scuttled at all comes from a small handful of crew testimonies and a BBC documentary of an undersea expedition to the ship, which actively contradicted the research paper also created from that expedition. So first of all, we should be calling those BBC dramas, and second of all, the number of testimonies saying everything was fine down below decks until it went down were outnumbered like 12 to 1 by people saying everything was flooding, on fire, and vibrating apart because there was a chunk of propeller stuck in the f***ing rudder.
This is fine.
Then there's the story of First Officer Hans Oels, who assumed command of the ship after the entire chain of command had been given a 16-inch face high five when Rodney put the lights out in the conning tower. There are 3 eyewitness accounts telling the very short story of his command, the first of which states that he had given the order to prepare scuttling charges and was headed aft to help the wounded. The second account, from when he reached the aft deck next to Caesar and Dora turrets, which had both been freshly knocked out by the British, says that as he arrived, he told the crew present that they needed to get below decks to assist in damage control duties, after having apparently just given an order to set scuttling charges and abandon ship. Oels would then disappear below decks, where the third report takes place as he met with sailors from the inner workings who were trying to get to the main deck. Oels would promptly tell them to turn around and help with damage control efforts, as the ship was completely fine and combat capable.
What?
So none of the reports make any sense because they're all contradicting each other. And to make everything even less believable, nobody has any idea at what time or if the direct order to scuttle the ship was given at all. The only thing we can confirm is that everybody was ordered to abandon ship. Some people argue that because all the watertight doors below decks were open, she must have been scuttled, which makes a lot of sense if you don't think about it, because if I'm downstairs and I get told the boat's going down, I will open as many doors as I have to get off the goddamn boat. Oh, but the doors are still open. No shit, Sherlock, what am I supposed to do? Close them behind me on the way out? The ocean floor don't give a damn if that thing's open or not.
none of the sauce.
Yes, Mom.
And the entire reason people are so worried about the doors is because the superstructure of the Bismarck is still largely intact. When ships get deeper and deeper, the air locked in the lower compartments eventually tears its way out of the ship and wreaks all colors of havoc on the superstructure. Because Busy's topside isn't completely disintegrated as opposed to what would have happened from being shot a bunch of times, the numbnut fanboys use that combined with the doors being open as further proof that the ship was scuttled. And while it is true that you need a large amount of hole to let all that air out of, apparently the Bismarck superstructure was already well ventilated, because I guess Busy's design priorities were working air conditioning and then better AA guns. And even if they didn't have enough air holes by default, I don't think you would have noticed under the weight of the Brits handing them a lifetime supply. Then there's a guy that said something along the lines of, "We heard the scuttling charges blow and jumped off the ship." The problem with that is, how do you know for a fact that the explosion you heard was scuttling charges? That could have just as readily been the boilers failing or a flash fire in the powder or ammunition rooms. The only real reason you would think that those were scuttling charges was if you had been told that scuttling charges were there and never verifying it yourself because your priority was getting off the damn boat. And in the small off chance that all the reports of Ole's orders are true, that still doesn't confirm that the ship was scuttled. If anything, it might even point more to the idea that his objective wasn't to sink the ship, but to sow as much confusion and misinformation among the reports as possible so nobody could nail down what the hell happened and make sure no one could make a propaganda victory out of it. But that also means you can't prove the ship was scuttled, so your argument is invalid. And you can't prove that she was scuttled, so neither is yours, fuckwipe. And even if she was, that still counts as the Brits sinking the ship. If you knock out 99% of the enemy's health bar in a game and they leave said game, you're still getting points in the kill feed. Now, if you rage quit a game at the beginning of the match, then sure, you can say that you didn't lose because the fight hadn't even started yet. But if you bail out because you were getting your hindquarters handed to you on a silver platter so bad that you're being spawn camped by the bullets, then you definitely lost the match. Because we all know that if losing wasn't the cause of that effect, then you'd still be playing the game. The Brits still sank the Bismarck, them's the rules.
So you get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.
The fact that there are people out there who think this is the best German battleship, not even the best battleship, the best German battleship of all time. If it was the Scharnhorst, I'd understand. If it was the Emden, I'd understand. But there is an incomparable difference between respecting the actual battle achievements of your enemies and screaming your head off for the ocean floor's second biggest paperweight. Anybody who actually believes this battleship is genuinely the greatest shit since sliced bread is probably on so much smoke the yoinking of Venezuela's cartel president benefited them directly. I gotta wrap this up or I'm gonna be here all day. So in summation, the Bismarck was one of the more powerful German battleships ever built. And if you ask me, its full unbridled history wouldn't even need embellishments, bias, or dramatic effect to make a good movie or story out of it. But anyone trying to sell you on the idea that it was the be-all, end-all of battleships throughout all space and time needs to see either a doctor or a therapist, and I don't care which. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.